A little bit about Jared before he comes up. Well, Jared does refer to himself as the concierge of the kingdom and finds deep joy in connecting individuals, organizations, and ideas. He has served as clergy in Denver for over 30 years and is currently the executive director of Sacred Place, working to help people cultivate love for their neighbors and neighborhoods. Jared and his daughter, Kenna, live with Amos, their beloved, I had to say this like 3 times, just Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. That's small dog. And they live in the Virginia Vale neighborhood. You guys you're in the hood, right? And apparently he really loves the Bull and Bush pub, which is not too far from here. So, Jared, everybody.
Well, one of my earliest childhood memories is in a red brick church in Oklahoma. I'm about 4 years old, and after Sunday service, I've wandered back to the nursery to do my work of rearranging the nursery. As I looked out the window, I noticed my father, the preacher, leaving the church, driving out of the parking lot in our 1970s brown wood-paneled station wagon, leaving me locked inside the church alone. Now, what's interesting as I look back on that memory is that there was not a moment of anxiety inside of me being locked in a church alone. I just simply went back to rearranging the nursery, and it wasn't until my father came barreling back into the parking lot in the station wagon and his hands fumbling with his keys trying to unlock the door that I recognized that something might have gone wrong. It was that same church a couple of years later that I waded into the baptistry with my father. The baptistry in this Baptist church, was behind the choir loft and overlooked the entire congregation. And so I waded out in my oversized white robe into the center of the sanctuary, in which there had been a concrete cinder block put at the bottom of the baptistry for me to stand on. And so my father waded me out to the middle of the baptistry, and I stood on the cinder block. And I stood still for a little while my father, in his 1970s thick black hair and thick black glasses, talked at length about the importance of baptism, of which point I began to sway back and forth and noticed how enjoyable it was to sway back and forth on the cinder block until there was a moment in which I stopped swaying and started sinking. And in that moment, I invited the choir to join me in my baptism as I splashed violently water outside of the baptistry onto the entirety of the choir. That Baptist church was where I learned faith, the faith that upheld me for the most part, until it didn't uphold and sometimes felt like it was as much drowning me as saving me. And so, at church, found myself walking back into years later. I had a mentor who once said, Jared, you always tell the truth in love. If it's not loving, it's not the truth. And if it's not the whole truth, then it's not actually love. So how do you tell the truth about your family's history? I had walked back into that church in March of 2019. Was the first one into the empty sanctuary. I had walked down the center aisle and up behind the pulpit where my father had served as a pastor for my father's funeral. And as I stood up to share my father's eulogy, my question was, how much of someone else's story are you to share? And when does their story become your own truth to tell? There's a complexity of my family's story, a complexity that I didn't learn until my mid-30s. I had already gone through the separation of my marriage, and it wasn't until that point that my father confided in me his secrets that he had carried for decades. Stories that he had not told anyone, and when he told me, he asked me to never tell as well. My father joined the Air Force at age 18. He was stationed in the Philippines. He met a woman who showed him affection and attention. Except for when her affection and attention was shown to someone else, things went bad and he turned and chose alcohol. And then in one particularly unpleasant moment, he, in an intoxicated stupor, tried to sneak back onto the Air Force Base and got caught up in the barbed wire on top of the wall. He was removed, and somewhere in the story, he takes a swing at an MP, and he finds himself in the infirmary for several weeks, and then is shipped back to the States to finish his time. My father leaves the Air Force at the same rank that he entered. He shows back up in America, in Clovis, at which point I will read from his eulogy. Joe would serve in Taiwan and the Philippines at the beginning of the Vietnam conflict. In some ways, it is only because of God's protection and his mercy that his story does not end there. He returned after serving 2 years overseas and was stationed at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico. While stationed at Cannon, he began attending a local church and met Marilyn Qualls, who was born and grew up on a farm outside of Clovis. She was a striking young woman with a shared love of music, playing the clarinet in her high school band. Joe and Marilyn were married on October 12, 1963. In 1963, the Filipino woman that had shown my father affection and attention birthed a child. My father was the biological father of a child that he never knew her name. He never told anyone because it seemed to be all those churches, the red brick one and all the other ones. I was just a little too much truth to tell. And so when he told me, I held that story for a decade. He eventually told my sisters in the years right before his death. About a year after my father's funeral, I received a message from my aunt and uncle. There was someone trying to build a connection with our family who had found our family through online ancestry and DNA testing. We exchanged emails and eventually a phone call. Her name was Kimmy. Kimmy was the daughter of the Filipino woman that had shown my father affection and attention all those years ago. Kimmy had 3 siblings, all from different biological fathers. I shared about my father and she shared about her mother. Her mother was what was politely called a service wife. She described her mother as young and beautiful and poor. The reality that Kimmy was born into was malnutrition. Kimmy would be adopted by an American family because they would be able to provide for her what her biological mother could not. That family would return to the US, live in Texas, and in somewhat of the almost unimaginable possibility, Kimmy would move to Denver, Colorado, and live for 11 years, just miles from my family's home. I shared the eulogy with Kimmy, told her what I had shared in that red brick church about my father and my family. But sometimes it feels like our stories are slipping out from underneath us. That which has upheld us is no longer doing so. And the question is, what do we do with life at that point? For me, it was the choice to stand up at my father's funeral and try to tell the story humbly and honestly, holding both grace and truth, telling the story of someone who wasn't perfect And maybe most importantly of all, remembering that my father's story and my story and all of our stories are a part of a much larger story, that story of God. And in the story of God, there are no perfect people. There's only broken families, broken promises, broken lives, broken hearts. Broken, I would offer, is the story that we uphold. Finished my father's funeral, and as the sanctuary was empty, decided to walk around behind the choir loft and look into the empty baptistry. The cinder block was not still there, but I looked into the empty space and I was incredibly thankful. Thankful for the family and the faith that has upheld me. And thankful for all the moments where it felt like I was drowning and this faith wasn't particularly helpful. And all those moments that I had questions about what stories to hold and what secrets to share, I felt upheld by the love of God. I walked out of the sanctuary, walked past the nursery, smiled. As I walked out of the red brick church, I felt that I was being upheld by something like love and grace and truth.